Good evening, everybody. Kurt Risch here, and thanks for joining me on the One Shepherd, where we support seekers and believers. So today we are starting with the Gospel of Luke, and we are going to read the introduction. Sometimes we need to take a step back to gain perspective. It is one thing for 3 of Jesus' 12 disciples to write about the life of Christ. It is quite another for someone who did not know him to write about him. Luke never met Jesus, yet chose to follow him. An obviously educated man who, as Colossians 4:14 tells us, was a physician. Luke learned all that he could about Jesus and shared his findings with us. Thus, his gospel provides a step back, a unique perspective on Jesus' birth, ministry, death, and resurrection. About the author. Neither Luke nor Acts has a byline, so we are left to deduce the author's identity. The author writes that he was not an eyewitness to the events surrounding Jesus, but had gathered the reports of others. On the other hand, the author was present with Paul at some of the events described in Acts, events that belong to the we sections of Acts. So the author must have been a lately converted Christian who knew Paul and sometimes traveled with him. Early Christian writings, from the works of Justin Martyr to Tertullian, identify the author as Luke, an identification that was firmly in place by the 3rd century AD. Luke was an educated man by ancient standards. He was capable of writing in high Greek style, and Colossians 4:10-14 seems to indicate that Luke was not of the circumcision. That is not Jewish. If so, Luke would be the only Gentile author of the New Testament book. Tradition says that after accompanying Paul on some of his missionary journeys, Luke settled in Philippi, investing his life in the ministry of the Philippian church. Neither Luke nor Acts indicates when they were written, so this too must be deduced. The last event recorded in the book of Acts is the first Roman imprisonment of Paul. Therefore, the earliest Acts could have been written is in AD 62. Most scholars choose between two times for the Gospel, early to late 60s or mid-70s to late 80s. Two factors determine the choice: the date of the other Gospels and the portrayal of the fall of Jerusalem in Luke. Almost everyone considers Luke the second or third Gospel to be written, though they debate whether Mark or Matthew was the first. The first Gospel, whether Matthew or Mark, is usually dated in the 60s. Those who place Matthew and Mark in the 60s often date Luke after AD 70 to allow time for the circulation of Matthew and Mark. Another reason given for dating Luke after AD 70 is the claim that Luke presents Jesus' predictions of the fall of Jerusalem in such a way as to indicate that the city had already fallen. I'm just going to interject here, guys. This introduction from the Nelson New King James Study Bible was written quite some time ago, and I'm fairly certain there is new evidence about the dating of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, putting them much earlier, I believe in as early as sometime in the AD 40s. Anyhow, let's go ahead and continue. Neither of these arguments is decisive, given that the major figures of the early church had contact with one another. There is no reason to assume that it took a decade for a major gospel to get into circulation. The prediction of the fall of Jerusalem in Luke is unique among the gospel accounts in focusing on the fall of the city and not merely the destruction of the temple. Thus, what Jesus describes as a judgment, which is the result of covenant unfaithfulness, similar to the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. The fact that Luke includes Jesus' prediction of a second fall of the city does not mean the city had already been destroyed when the book was written, since the sequel to Luke, the book of Acts, does not record either Peter's death, Paul's death, or even the fall of Jerusalem. In the face of Jesus' clear prediction of it, it is most likely that Luke was written in the early to mid-60s. A date in the later 60s is also possible. The characteristics. The Gospel of Luke is unique in several ways. It is the only Gospel that has a sequel, Acts. Both Luke and Acts include an account of the Ascension, an event that only Luke describes in detail. Second, Luke is the longest of the four Gospels. Third, Luke records a wide variety of miracles, teaching and parables, making it the fullest portrait of Jesus' ministry. Much of the materials in chapters 9 to 19 appear only in Luke. In all, about 1/3 of the Gospel of Luke is unique. Fourth, Luke is the only Gospel addressed to an individual. Luke writes to Theophilus, who was probably a Gentile believer. For Luke, Jesus is the promised Messiah. We see that in chapter 1, 31 to 35. The Son of God, chapter 9, verse 35. The servant through whom God works, 4 verses 16 to 18. And the Lord who is called to sit at God's right hand, exerting his authority and giving the Spirit to those who believe. Though aspects of God's plan are fulfilled in Jesus' first coming, other parts of the plan remain to be fulfilled when Jesus returns. Luke wrote his gospel to reassure Theophilus, a Gentile and a new believer, that God was still at work in the Christian community, founded by Jesus. Luke presents God's grace as revealed in Jesus' ministry on earth. He emphasizes that this grace is available to Gentiles, even though the promises relating to Jesus' ministry stretch back into Israel's history. For this reason, Luke also concentrates on Jesus' relationship to the nations and the leaders of Israel. The rejection of Israel does not mean the failure of God's plan. On the contrary, although they did not know it, their rejection was part of God's plan from the beginning. In fact, persecution of the Christian community would be the means by which the church would spread the good news throughout the world. Jesus himself had predicted that this would happen. Structure and overview. The first two chapters of Luke emphasize the Old Testament and its promises of a Messiah, while chapter 3, 1 and through chapter 4, verse 13, demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah, who can resist the evil one. Then chapter 4, verse 14 through chapter 9, verse 50 introduce Jesus' power and teaching. In these chapters, Luke records Jesus' claims to authority and the numerous miracles that supported them. Even with these miracles as evidence, the people rejected Jesus while the disciples' faith in him steadily grew. The growing rift between Jesus and the Jewish leadership is seen in chapters 9, verse 51 through chapters 19, verse 44. This breach is emphasized most in chapters 9 to 13. But in chapters 14 to 19, attention turns to Jesus' instruction of his disciples. The last section, chapter 19, verse 45 through chapter 24, verse 53, portrays the final controversies, the trial, the death of Jesus, and the resurrection and ascension. The book ends with Jesus telling the disciples to wait for the coming of the Spirit. By now, they should have realized that everything that had taken place in Jesus' life was promised in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. Jesus is the promised Messiah. Forgiveness of sin can be obtained only through him. The disciples were witnesses to this fact. Their mission was to share this good news with all nations, not merely the Jews. Jesus gave them this task, but he also provided them with the power to carry it out. Thus, it is clear that Luke's gospel centers on God's plan to provide salvation to the world. It closes anticipating the spread of the gospel that is recorded in its sequel, the book of Acts. And then there's an interesting little timeline here, guys, of Jesus' life all the way through the crucifixion and resurrection. Christ in the scriptures. Just like we'd expect from a family doctor, Dr. Luke sensitively describes Jesus as one who reaches out personally and heals those who are mercilessly caged by devastating illnesses. As a person, he is concerned with people, whereas Matthew likes to refer to Jesus as the Son of David and Mark refers to him as the Son of God. Luke's favorite expression is the Son of Man. Jesus' humanity and compassion are repeatedly stressed by the author. This, coupled with Luke's portrayal of Jesus' sinless perfection, set up his logical conclusion. Because Jesus is the only perfect person born of a woman, and because he identifies compassionately with the plight of sufferings of sinful people, he alone is qualified to carry our sorrows, bear our sin, and to offer us the priceless gift of salvation. Guys, that's it for the reading of our introduction to the Gospel of Luke. Thanks for joining me. Be sure to like and subscribe below, as that helps spread the word of our Gospel readings. Also, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in here. Otherwise, you can join us tomorrow morning for our continued reading of the Old Testament. We are in the book of Exodus. Or tomorrow evening for continuing with our New Testament Gospel reading of the book of Luke. Again, have a great evening and God bless.